Hello again, I'm Nicola Curtin, Program Evaluator here at the COE, and this lecture is on designing effective survey questions. So really after this lecture, you should understand what are some of the issues you'll want to consider when designing questions for a survey, what makes for good and bad survey questions, what to consider when you're formulating your response categories for these questions, and what are some best practices for formatting a survey overall. It's important to note that they offer advanced degrees in survey design and survey methods, and so really what you're getting here is a very kind of quick introduction to these issues. I've tried to be somewhat comprehensive in terms of some of the, big don't do these things when you're designing your survey questions. And there are, of course, a ton of really great resources online. And as always, you should contact me if you have any questions. And I'm happy always to, help out and look over surveys and that be of assistance in that way. I think, when I teach survey design, one of the things I always start with is, and there's been, a lot written on this, that surveys are really a form of communication that, you might not be in the room when your respondents are completing your survey, but you are communicating with them, right? And we know that we are most effective at communication when we consider who we're talking to. In this case, of course, you're talking to your respondents, right? So you need to think about who they are. When we keep it simple, right, when we're sort of, we don't make things too complex, when we're clear and direct, and when people feel respected and understood. And I actually have a separate lecture on culturally competent, sort of what are some of the things to think about in designing culturally competent questions. And I think that really speaks to that last point. But I can't highlight enough that, it's important to kind of think about who you're collecting information from, right? And what are some of their assumptions about the world? What do they know? What do they not know? And you really have to sort of think about these things as you're designing your surveys. So before you begin your survey design, we're going to kind of come back. I think in each lecture I've sort of said you always have to return to this question, right? What is your evaluation question? What information do you need to make an informed decision about your program? And of course, who are you going to be sharing that information with? So we kind of go here, you want to think about, okay, what's your question? Who will be completing the survey, right? I said your audience is important. Who's going to use the information? So sometimes you're collecting information from people who won't be using that information. Sometimes they're maybe the same group. And how will that information be used? So what kinds of things are you going to want to do with it? So for example, if you might want to make group comparisons, if for some reason you've reason to think, let's say, that women and men or young people and older people, or there might be differences, within gender identity or by gender identity in people's experiences of your program, you are going to want to think about those things as you design your survey, because you're going to want to collect information that will allow you to look at those things, right? The thing about a survey is you cannot look at or understand something you don't have a question corresponding to, right? So you really do need to think about that. If you think age is important, then you better ask your participants their age, because otherwise, what can you do? So again, this really just speaks to when we think about what good communication is, just like good communication, good survey questions, use simple, common language. Now, of course, what's common for one particular group of people might vary. So, again, this is where knowing your audience or knowing your respondents is important. Good questions are concise, they're specific. They're not threatening when addressing sensitive issues. We'll talk a little bit about this. And this is, again, actually, different communities have different ideas about what might be sensitive or threatening. So you, again, really need to know the group of people you're surveying. They do not use double negatives. They avoid universals. We avoid biased terms or leading questions. And they have only one part. They're not what we call double-barreled. And I will give some examples of each of these. We're sort of going to talk about each of these. I'll give you sort of an example of what not to do or how not to ask a question, and then a better way to maybe ask that question. I'm not saying it's the best way, But just to sort of give you an example of what this would look like. So let's take our first two pieces. So using clear, simple, and common language. And some of the examples here are probably quite exaggerated, but I think they're just sort of used to illustrate the principle, right? So how delighted with the level of peer interlocution, I don't even know how to pronounce that word, right? Interlocution during the workshop were you, right? So really just what you want to know is how satisfied were you with peer discussions? So sort of thinking, sometimes when you make your first go through, your questions might be more less simple, right? They might, for whatever reason, use maybe more technical or jargony language. And so you just want to be ruthless about going through and breaking everything down into very simple, easy to understand language. Sometimes we also, when we first go through, asking our questions, they become quite long. We sort of are thinking about all the various things that we might want to ask about, but you really, again, want to boil it down to this point here, about being concise, right? So, you might want to have all this backstory, and it may end up being important to a question that you have backstory. We'll actually talk about that a little bit later, because I think sometimes when you're dealing with sensitive issues, your questions may be a little bit less concise, and we'll talk about why that would be. But generally speaking, if you just, again, want to know how satisfied they were with the peer discussions in your workshops, you don't really need to worry about kind of, all this other business that's in the first example here. So good survey questions are specific, and sometimes this is actually, this is why it's really important to pilot your survey. And ideally, actually, it's helpful sometimes to pilot your survey both with somebody who is like the group of people that will be eventually responding to it, and somebody who is not an insider, because sometimes they can tell you when you're not being clear or specific. So for example, if you asked a group of people if they voted in the last election, they might not understand what you mean, right? And particularly, let's say, in the example here, if you're talking about the midterm election, because many times people might be thinking about just, presidential elections. So you really just want to be as specific and clear as possible. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this sensitive issues question. I think, again, this is where it's really, really important to know your audience, because there will be certain topics that are going to be particularly sensitive for some groups of people, and of course, not at all sensitive for others. And one of the tricks when you're talking about sensitive issues is to kind of ensure that you are not sounding judgmental, or that if you're concerned that participants will be worried about you judging them, that you sort of avoid what we call this social desirability bias. And so the example here, right? Have you had sex without a condom in the last month? On the one hand, you might think, oh, that's not a big deal to ask, but some people might feel like worried that you might judge them. And so what we've done in the second question, which you'll see is less concise, is that we've kind of tried to create a norm, which is that some people, and this indeed is true, we know this, right, that some people have sex without a condom. And how often have you done that in the last month? There's a lot of ways in which you can kind of create these norms. You could say, like, research has shown, if that indeed is true. Another way sometimes when you have a sensitive issue is to actually ask the question in a way that assumes that they've done it. And then, of course, you want to have a response category that allows them to say, oh, actually, I haven't done that. So just you want to think about how you are, if you have any sensitive questions, you really want to think carefully about how to ask them. And I will say that there's some really good resources available online, and I think it's worth spending some time reading a little bit more about this, particularly if you have sensitive topics that you're going to be asking your participants about. So don't use double negatives. Again, this might seem quite obvious, but sometimes they sneak in. So I have never not liked a workshop facilitator. I liked the workshop facilitators, right? So it's just easier for people, these never nots or didn't not or whatnot. Try and avoid those. And also avoid universals. And these I think actually sneak in a little bit more easily, but like I always study for exams. Well, the reality actually is that there are very few people always do any behavior. And actually, when we want to assess social desirability bias in our surveys, we include questions like this because, none of us are perfect. And so we actually, these are sometimes ways of tripping up people who have this strong social desirability bias. So a better way to ask this question is I study for exams, right? And one of your response categories, right? You could have a response category that will go from never to always. And so in that sense, but you don't want universals like I always or I never in your question themselves, in the questions themselves. So you also want to avoid biased terms and leading questions. So in the first example here, it's a biased in that you're putting your own opinion, right? Like that these are world-renowned experts. Now you might just say, oh, but I'm stating a fact. They are indeed world-renowned experts, but that is a signal, right? Again, a survey is a communication tool. And this is a signal to your respondents that you hold these facilitators in high regard. And again, that may be true, but the idea, of course, is to make it okay for participants to give you their true perspective on things. And so you want your communication in some ways to be as neutral as possible. So just what is your opinion, right? That's what you want to know. You don't need to interject your own opinion or any kind of editorializing on folks. Another way is, don't you agree that Stanford School of Medicine is awesome, is incredibly innovative, right? Like you're sort of setting up the question in that way that's really leading them, right? It'll be harder in some ways because they'll have to disagree with you to say that they don't think it's innovative, for example. So a better way is just how innovative, right? How innovative is it? And then they can, indicate their agreement. So I think sometimes these kinds of questions can really leak in, especially when we're doing program evaluation. We love our programs. We think they're awesome, but what we really want, of course, is to get people's real perspectives. And so we have to sort of take ourselves out of the survey in a lot of ways. It's this funny tension, right? Because you really want to think about who's completing the survey. So you've got to do a lot of that, right? Like imagining who they are, and then also sort of removing yourself at the same time. So oftentimes when we talk about questions, we'll see these double-barreled questions. And basically what that means is that you're actually asking about two different things at the same time, and it's confusing to participants. So if we say, we ask people, right, the degree to which they agree that our nurses were efficient and friendly, well, what if they thought the nurses were friendly, but they weren't efficient, or vice versa, right? How do you respond to that question? Like, do you pick the neutral point because you strongly agree, but also strongly disagree? It creates a problem for the participants, and it creates a problem for you, right? Because you're interpreting this communication that you've had via a survey. So better in these cases to break these kinds of questions up into two separate questions. One that asks about their efficiency and one that asks about the level of friendliness. So again, actually, these things sort of sneak in, and you want to go through, always review your survey and just make sure that you sort of are catching these kinds of things. So we're going to turn now to what we call response categories. Response categories are basically the options you give participants in close-ended survey questions, the options you give them to respond to your particular questions. So I do want to note that you can include some open-ended. What we call open-ended is you ask, there's a question stem, and then you leave it blank, and participants write in whatever it is they think. You probably don't want to have a lot of those on your survey because they're somewhat burdensome, right? They require that the participant think and write, and you tend not to always necessarily get the best data if you have a lot of them, the best information. And they're harder basically to compare responses. You usually have to go through and code them and whatnot. They're helpful for kind of qualitative, like in general, what do you think about our program? And then you can kind of include those snippets in the report. Certainly I say, it might make sense to include some, but mostly you want these kind of what we call these close-ended responses. And here are just some common response categories. So when you're thinking about response categories, there's sort of a rule of thumb. A lot of people say you should try to use no more than 3 or 4 different kinds of response categories. So you sort of look back here, pick a couple of these, but not using all of them, all of the different kinds. You want to give, and I'm going to give you examples of what this would look like to not do these things. You want to give them clear-cut answer choices, make it the response is easy to navigate. And we're going to talk about what does it look like when response categories overlap. Don't do that. What does it look like when they're unbalanced? And we'll talk about how to balance them. And make sure that they cover all possibilities. And so we'll talk about that too. All right, so first, you have to make sure your response categories don't overlap. So maybe you can see here what is wrong, right? I'm asking people to tell me how many credit hours they've completed. Well, if they have completed 25, it's kind of confusing. What box do they check? The same with 55, and you can see 85 here. So really what you want to do is have these non-overlapping, or what we might call exclusive response categories. You really want to make sure your categories are balanced. And so here we're asking people, tell me about your leadership skills. And you can see that they can say their leadership skills are good to outstanding. Well, what if they feel like their leadership skills are not that strong? There's no real way to capture that here, right? And of course, this becomes a problem if you say, tell me, what's your opinion about our workshop? And you just have good to outstanding. And then you go back to your donors and you say, well, 100% of people thought that our workshop, our program is at least good. Well, sure, but you didn't leave people any opportunity to tell you otherwise, right? And you really need to do that. So you have to have these balanced categories. Here is an example. You could have more categories. There's not like you can only have 4, you could have 6 here, but they just need to be balanced, right, across a spectrum of responses. You want them to also be exhaustive. And what that means is that you really need to be able to cover all reasonably possible responses. Look, there are like a multitude of responses, but you want to think like, what's a reasonably possible response? So if I ask people, what kind of laptop do you own? And I only give them the option of saying a PC or a Mac. Well, what if they don't own a laptop? So what if they own some other kind of laptop? So a better way to do this is to ask them other, and then, whenever you have an other category, it's actually helpful to say, please specify, and then allow them to write something in. Especially what's nice about that is, look, if everybody has, if you have 100 people and everybody who puts other writes, a different thing, you might not use that data, but if half your sample says other and they all write in the same thing, that's actually helpful for you, right? You know more then about your participants. And then, of course, I don't own a computer or I don't own a laptop. So I just want to talk very briefly here about formatting your survey. Again, lots has been written on this. There's tons of online resources. You want your survey to be as short as possible, right? You want to get the best information, and you get the best information from bright-eyed, bushy-tailed respondents, right? And if it takes an hour to complete your survey, by the end of that hour, the data is just probably not going to be as good. It's harder for people to pay attention. So this is so hard, right? You want to know all the things usually, but you just want it to be as short as possible. You want to start with a brief explanation of the purpose of your survey. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to tell them everything you're thinking, but just a short paragraph sort of telling them, why are you collecting this information? How's it going to be used? And I just want to return to the ethics issue here, right? You might want to consider getting consent from people, right? But either way, you have to tell them how you're going to use the information. You want it to be professional looking and easy to navigate. And so just associated with that, or thinking about questions that are similar, grouping them together. This just makes it easier for participants, right? Breaking it into logical sections, pages. If you're doing Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, you can do kind of page breaks and have good flow. Sort of think about flow. You want to give simple instructions for answering the questions, particularly, let's say, if response categories change or you're asking different kinds of questions. Oftentimes people say you should place demographic questions at the beginning of a survey. Some folks I know like to, if they feel like some of the demographic questions are going to be sensitive, they actually place those later in the survey. I'll say for the most part, I feel this way, maybe particularly with a lot of younger folks. Well, this isn't true, to a person, but they're oftentimes used to answering now kind of questions about identity-based questions or demographic-based questions. And so sometimes I think things that a few years ago, or questions that a few years ago may have been more sensitive, are now just more normalized, right? We talk about, let's say, sexuality more openly now. But of course, you might have a community where that's not the norm, right? So asking people their sexual orientation as the first question might be jarring. And this actually gets to my next point, which is you want to start with the interesting questions, right? You want to get people engaged, get them invested in your survey. If you have interesting questions, you want them to be easy and non-threatening. So really, these sensitive questions are best left at the very least, for after you've at least asked a few questions that are easier and not threatening, right? Because what you don't want to do is have somebody read it and sort of instantly feel threatened or worried, and they'll stop. They're more likely to stop. There's sort of basic social psychology. You have people, they've already committed to starting the questionnaire. They're more likely to continue. You want to have clear instructions or patterns built in. Again, if you're doing it online, this is pretty easy. I'm happy also to talk you through SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics if you're having any issues, and there's a ton, again, of resources online. But have clear instructions or patterns, that should say, not patterns, for skipping or kinds of contingency questions, right? Like, so, did you attend our workshop? Did you attend this particular workshop, right? And if they say no, maybe they're going to go below to different questions. And if they say yes, they're going to have questions about the workshop. And then finally, open-ended questions. You really want them at the end. Yes, that means probably the data isn't going to be as rich as if you ask them at the start. But usually, because they require a little bit more, it's nice to just have them at the end of the survey. Now, none of these rules are set in stone, so you may have a very compelling reason, for example, for having an open-ended question at the start, or starting with these very sensitive questions. You'll have to sort of make some of those decisions yourself, but these are general guidelines. So that's it for this brief overview. Good luck to you all as you design surveys, and as always, please let me know if you have any questions, and I'm happy to help.